In this video, I will present information from Chapter 8 of Human Anatomy and Physiology 11th edition. This chapter focuses on joints. In particular, in this video, I'll be talking about body movements. So let's get started. We can look at 4 different levels of motion that are allowed at synovial joints. I know it says 3 here. It's basically only considering uniaxial, biaxial, and multiaxial. And that's because at non-axial joints, there's very limited motion. But I'll be honest with you, I consider 0 to be a level of that range of motion. So again, non-axial, it's just going to be minor slipping movements. So this is a great place to find this would be the intercarpal joints. So all those little joints in between your carpal bones, they're going to glide across each other, but in no particular plane, and there's only minor movement. Same goes down for your tarsal bones, so those intertarsal joints in your feet. So now we get into these ranges of motion in which you see significant movement or dramatic movement along at least one plane of the body. So these are organized by the number of planes around that joint or along which that joint will move. So if a joint can move in only one plane, so remember there are planes, the choices are sagittal, coronal, and transverse. Those are our 3 options. So uniaxial is going to only move along one of those planes. And an example would be the joints of your phalanges, so finger joints. Those phalanges are going to move along only the sagittal plane. And so when you're doing this, you're going to have to remember back to anatomical position. So upright posture with arms at sides, palm facing forward, feet facing forward, or toes facing forward, that is. So the finger joints in that position only move along the sagittal plane. So it's uniaxial. Biaxial is going to be movement in 2 planes. So a wrist is a great example of that. Again, in anatomical position, we can abduct or adduct the wrist, and we can flex or extend the wrist. So we can move it along the coronal plane or the sagittal plane. Multiaxial, so movement in all 3 planes. Really, there are 2 joints that are going to allow this, and this is going to be the shoulder joint and the hip joint. And these are joints that can allow movement in the coronal, sagittal, or transverse planes. So we can get abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, as well as things like circumduction. So those are the 4 ranges of motion, or levels of range of motion, that are allowed at different synovial joints, along with some examples for each. So you can also have 3 different types of movement. So before it was how much can it move, and now if it can move, how does it move? So first off, we have gliding. So this is going to be flat surfaces of at least 2 bones that are basically just going to slide over each other. So this would be something that maybe you would see with non-axial bone, like those intercarpal joints, but we see gliding. We can have angular motions, so angular, angle. It changes the angle of a joint. So these are the things, usually when I think of joints, this is what I think of. So angular movements, and this is things like flexion, extension, hyperextension, abduction, adduction, or circumduction. So all of those are examples of angular movements. And then finally, there's rotation. So it's turning your bone along its longitudinal axis. A great example of that would be the radius. So as you are supinating and pronating, your radius at the humeral joint, the radiohumeral joint, is going to be rotating. So here are just some more examples applying these different words. So at the wrist, we have a gliding motion. So those intercarpal joints, they're slightly gliding across each other, but mainly what this is talking about is the fact that if you do kind of a version of the royal wave with your hand bobbing back and forth from medial to lateral, this is a gliding motion at the wrist. So basically where those carpals meet the radius and ulna. We can have angular movements, so flexion, extension, hyperextension. You can see that here with the head and neck. You can see that with bending over at the waist. And you can see that with the shoulder joint as well as the knee joint, although at the knee joint, in most of us, it's limited to just flexion and extension with no hyperextension. Abduction and adduction are movements either laterally or medially, and so good examples are going to be at the hips and at the shoulders. And abduction, I don't know why, but I think the word abduct is to take away, and so it's moving away from the body. So abduction is lateral movement of, say, the arm at the shoulder joint, and adduction is movement of that arm at the shoulder joint toward the midline of the body. And then circumduction is circle, so it's a circular movement at that joint. And again, we can do that at the shoulders, but we can also do that at the hips to some extent, although it's much more limited. Additionally, you can also move your head. You can rotate it left and right. So that's also an example of rotation. Then we have some specialized words that describe some movements. So rotation of the radius and ulna is actually called supination and pronation. And so when we think about that, basically this is going to be pronation, and with pronation you are taking your palm and you are in anatomical position spinning it toward the posterior. So pronation, palm is posterior. Supination, palm is going to be anterior. So those are pronation and supination. Those are examples of rotation of the radius and the ulna. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion occur down here at the foot. And you can see here, dorsiflexion is basically your toes lifted off the ground, your heel down on the ground. And plantar flexion is the opposite, your toes down on the ground and your heel lifted. So standing on your toes, plantar flexion. Standing on your heel, dorsiflexion. Also at the feet, we have inversion and eversion. So inversion is just the sole of the feet facing inward, so toward the midline of the body. And eversion is the sole of the foot facing outward or lateral to the body. We have 4 words that occur specifically for the mandible, so the lower jaw. So protraction and retraction. So if you push your mandible forward, that's protraction. And if you pull it back out or pull it back in, that's retraction. Additionally, elevation, basically it's closing your mouth. And depression of the mandible is opening your mouth. And then finally, opposition. So opposition is basically touching your thumb to all 4 of your other fingers on the same hand. That is opposition, and it's a special motion of the thumb. All right, so that leaves us with just a question for you to walk away with related to this topic.